You can start. Now we're live. Ready for you.
Okay. Thank you. So actually, we're talking about migration system, the reasons, all the systemic factors that are actually feeding the migration system. I was talking about bringing in into the discussion some, let's say, examples, especially from the region of the Balkan, and more specifically of Western Balkan. Actually, after talking about those, let's say, systemic reasons that are, of course, supported and backed by theories in place, as I mentioned before, feedback mechanism, chain migration, or cumulative, causation, for instance. Now I'm going to focus a little bit more, to be a little bit more specific, on migration systems profile. So actually, we're talking about a set of interacting elements, which means that we're talking about flows of people, ideas, and goods. Secondly, we're talking about social institutions, which, seen from a sociological perspective, are embedded in the culture of migration. Third, we are talking about strategies employed by particular actors. Here, we are talking about even individuals, households, policymaking, civil society organization at both ends, from the country of origin to the country of destination. The fourth element that actually, let's say, shape the migration system profile are the socioeconomic dynamics. That those, let's say, socioeconomic dynamics shape the ways in which the above three elements change as a response to transformation. What does it mean? Transformation, as I mentioned before, the history of our civilization is actually built on the experience of migration, but in different time of space, for different reasons, we have different migration trajectories. End of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, from Western Europe to United States or Canada. Nowadays we have from Middle East or South Asia, or even from Africa, from South, the global South, towards global North, actually. So the combination of interacting elements of social institutions, of strategies employed by particular actors, actually create the socioeconomic dynamics that actually can, let's say, shape the ways in which, a corridor of migration system is grown or is actually transformed. Here, I'd like to share with you my own experience from starting migration in Greece. Of course, Greece is part, geographically speaking, of the Balkans, but at the same time is, old member of European Union. So if we talk about migration in Greece, we see it from the perspective, institutionally speaking, of course, of European Union. And here, all those three elements that I mentioned before shape the dynamic of onward mobility of Albanian migrants in Greece towards other Western countries. What I am trying to say with this case study. In the 90s, Greece became the main destination of mass migration mobility of Albanians. More than 70% of migrants in Greece are of Albanian, come from Albania. Which means that, migration community in Greece is identified with Albanians. In 2009, 2008, 2009, we actually witnessed a very deep financial crisis and economic crisis in Greece, which actually changed the total dynamics of labor migration of Albanians in Greece. many Albanians migrants actually overnight were found themselves unemployed. And given the situation on the ground in the beginning of 2010, we have a shift, a change of mobility of Albanians from Greece to other Western countries. Today, for instance, I am conducting research on Albanian migration in United Kingdom, but not old Albanian migration, but Albanian migration coming from Greece in 2010 because or due to the economic crisis there. So can you understand this, new trajectory, this transnational, let's say, mobility of Albanians starting from Albania in 90s, actually accommodating themselves as labor migrants in Greece for more than 20 years, and then because of this economic crisis, and of course, precarious status, which means that without, permanent resident permits, without the proper integration policies in place, they're much more sensitive, sensible, much more vulnerable to pay the price of the crisis, and immediately they actually change, let's say, the dynamic of their mobility, leaving Greece, fleeing Greece, and finding another destination countries, mostly in Western Europe. This in theory of migration is called onward mobility or onward migration. So in a way, the four elements that constitute migration system profile are, as I mentioned, flow of people, ideas, and goods first. Second, social institutions that are embedded in the culture of migration. Third, strategies, individual or associational strategies employed by actors, different actors at micro or meso level. And of course, the socioeconomic dynamics, like economic crisis I mentioned before, that actually was, the reason behind the transformation or change of this, let's say, corridor from Albania to Greece and so on. So why migration system approach in migration studies is so important, and actually is in the agenda, in the current agenda of migration study. Why? Because actually it indeed dare to make another assumption or hypothesis by saying that, at least from my perspective, migration system can be seen as a form of postmodern discourse on migration studies. Why? Because before 20 years ago, when we talk about migration, we talk about, let's say, a linear mobility, starting from, here and finishing your journey there. Nothing in between, nothing, beyond this, let's say, linear, unidirectional push and pull movements. But today, or for instance, when we talked about 20 years ago about return migration, we saw return as something, as the end, the end of whatever movement. Actually, return today, it's part of transnational mobility. You can go back to your country of origin for whatever reason, as I mentioned before, but it could be only, let's say, a moment or a moment in time in order for you to project another movement toward another country that you see as a more, let's say, profitable beneficiary in order to make whatever your expectation, reality. So actually, that's why migration system is deemed or is seen as, as mentioned before from my perspective, it's part of postmodern or post-structural actually discourse. So from this perspective, migration system can be self-feeding, as we have seen, through chain migration. Turks, for instance, in Germany or in Austria, can be self-regulating. Why? Because the ability to shape dynamics according to the scale and magnitude of the systemic crisis. Again, the case of Greece and the onward migration of Albania, leaving Greece or fleeing from Greece towards other destinations. Of course, this new movement, this onward mobility, didn't happen by chance or by coincidence, no. Actually, we're talking about chain migration. There is an Albanian community in London, which actually act as, let's say, point of reference in order to facilitate this new movement. And the fourth one, self-modifying. So migration system can be self-modifying through the shift of migration flows to a different destination when the initial destination has been exhausted. Again, the case of Albanians in Greece that I've already talked about. I guess it was clear. It doesn't mean what's the definition of what are the parameters of migration system and why migration system is seen, is actually evaluated or assessed as highly important in order to actually upgrade the migration discourse, I mean, theoretically speaking, from traditional one to a postmodern one or post-structural one. But let's see it, or let's say, make it a little bit more specific, or trying to narrow it down by testing this migration system or migration system theory to the case of the first EU migration system and then Western Balkans migration system. So from this systemic perspective, we actually have a typological scheme of migration in Europe. So actually we have 4 types. Types is indeed are systems. Systems are corridors, as we have seen. So actually the first one is southern EU countries, namely Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. Those countries are considered recent immigration countries, which means that with no extensive experience in dealing or managing actually migration. The second time of this EU typological scheme is northwestern EU countries, including here Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, which is not anymore part of European Union, of course. Those countries are considered long-standing immigration countries, and of course, Europe. The third type of this typological scheme is composed by Scandinavian countries, including here Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. Those 3 countries have something in common, which is a generous welfare system. And the fourth type of this typological scheme are recently EU accession countries: Bulgaria, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Malta, Romania, Poland, and very recently, Croatia. So this is the typological scheme within which we have systemized those 4 types of migration system, which are not only there by chance or by coincidence, but based on systemic features of those 4 systems under the European, let's say, perspective. So when it comes to Western Balkans EU migration system, which indeed is subsystem, it's not exactly, it doesn't fall under this typological scheme that I have already mentioned, because Western Balkans, the dynamic of migration corridors followed by the migrants from Western Balkans, which much, touch upon, all those 4 systems actually. Here, why, for instance, Serbs and Bosniaks are settled, for instance, in Germany, in Austria, and why Albanians are settled in Greece, for instance, or in Italy. So it's interesting to understand even within the same subsystem, which I mentioned is the Western Balkan migration EU, we can actually pick up and make this, differences between, different destination countries. First of all, it has to do with migration dynamics. What does it mean, migration dynamics? Historical context and present forms. The combination of historical, let's say, legacy or whatever ties with the present dynamics, which are actually embedded in economic, political, cultural backgrounds. This is the first one. The second one is the privileged relations between receiving and sending countries. Let's take another an example. For instance, in Greece, we have more than 1 million Albanians, but they are not, legally speaking, considered Albanians. Why? Because a part of them are, the legal status is regulated under this umbrella of being of Greek origin. There is a minority in Albania, a Greek minority, which actually, since the beginning of the 90s, they, were benefited from this privileged approach of the Greek, let's say, political system towards them. So they are not sharing the same status, legal status with Albanian, with the rest of Albanians in Greece, which means that actually they are enjoying more, or they have a more permanent status that can guarantee or can actually make a more, let's say, secure system in place for this category or subcategory of Albanians in Greece. Or, for instance, you have special relationship between Bosniaks, Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Austria. Just a parenthesis, I have been in Austria and Vienna for a year. I actually won a fellowship from Austrian Academy of Science, so I had the opportunity to actually understand better the Western Balkan migration system, and more specifically, the relation between Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbs to Austria and Germany. So because of those, let's say, historical ties, that actually we can trace them back since the Habsburg Empire. And then in 60s and 70s, that, many former Yugoslavians were recruited and hired from Germany, from German, let's say, companies and Austrian companies as a foreign labor actually force. They created actually those communities of Bosniaks or Serbs or whatever, or North Macedonians actually, that actually perpetuate this kind of form of chain migration that I mentioned before. And of course, Austria and Germany are much more, let's say, flexible, more sensitive when it comes to actually dealing with the migrants from this part of the Western Balkans. And of course, as I already mentioned, we're talking about cultural and political affinities, which are historically rooted in both receiving and the country of the destination. Now let's go even, smaller. Talking about EU Western Balkan migration system, the corridors that are, compose this EU Western Balkans migration system. Here, we're talking about the factors that actually shape the formation of the system. First of all, the history of the region, as I have already mentioned, historical relationships and cultural linkages between, the Western Balkans countries and the rest of EU countries. Pre-existence of migration network that I have already mentioned, and as I have already mentioned, the selective or privileged, let's say, status or migration policies applied by receiving countries. Indeed, the migration patterns of the system are shaped by three factors. And now I'm talking about post-90s new migration, from Western Balkans to the European Union. I'm talking about ethnic complexities and historical, conflicts that often fueled interethnic conflicts in the region of Western Balkans. To be more, precise, I'm talking about what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina till 1995, from 1992 till 1995, with the genocide and the pogrom against the Muslim community there, Bosniaks, I mean, or what happened actually in Kosovo. So this, let's say, very conflictual, landscape, to which is fueled by ethnic, whatever conflicts or complexities, fueled this, new, let's say, migration movement towards European Union. Second, the transformation, economic transformation of the region after the fall of, Soviet Union. So we have a very interesting combination here, which are, let's say, regional, which are international, along with, let's say, within the state, actually. So the economic transformation that followed the systemic collapse of, a communist regime, the Soviet Union, in 1989. And at the fourth level, we're talking about political actors who actually caused the destabilization of the entire region. For instance, the practice of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, which were actually part of the Serbian, whatever expansion or the idea that former Yugoslavia belonged only to Serbs. So again, ethnic complexities, conflicts, economic transformation after the fall of Soviet Union, and political actors, leadership actually that caused whatever destabilization in the region. I have already talked about old migration, which means that migration in Western Balkans is not a new phenomenon; it's an old one. Former Yugoslavian recruited under the gastarbeiter system, to actually contribute, to make whatever contribution in actually reconstructing of the destroyed Germany at that time. So this was a regular one, of course, old migration, because it was under the guest worker recruitment bilateral scheme. The only exception to this, let's say, old migration was Albania. Albania was not part of this, actually scheme. While new migration, it was beginning of 90s, rapid developments that we have already seen, large-scale immigration from Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina to Austria and Germany. Albanians, on the other hand, towards two neighboring countries, Greece and Italy. And those, let's say, those developments in beginning of 90s actually reshape the dynamics of contemporary migration from the Western Balkans to European unions. Here we have, when we talk about new migration, we have, four types of this new migration. We have forced migration because of ethnic cleansing and war. We have ethnic migration, which means voluntary repatriation of whatever minorities. The example that I have already shared with you, Greek minority from Albania to Greece, actually, which were associated with the special benefits, privileged, let's say, status. The third type of this new migration is human trafficking, and the fourth one, labor migration. During the refugee crisis, we came to realize that there is a new, let's say, an additional whatever type of economic asylum seekers. It was in 2015 that over 1,300 migrants from Kosovo, Albania, and Serbia applied for refugee status along with Syrians at the time in the EU, with Germany being at the top of the preferred destination country. I'm not going into details about numbers and data, actually, But what is important when it comes to this, let's say, the new dynamic or the sustained dynamics of the Western Balkan migration system is the Europeanization. You know that, Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro are actually on the track of membership to the European Union. Recently, last year, we had the green light for Albania and North Macedonia starting accession negotiation with European Union under this umbrella migration or chapter 24 of the fundamentals, or as we used to know as Copenhagen criteria, are actually very high when it comes to negotiation. So under Europeanization, actually, we have come to notice that boundaries between the EU and the Western Balkan countries are increasingly becoming blurry, actually. Why? Because actually countries of Western Balkans are under, let's say, the monitoring of European Union. They have to fulfill certain criteria in place, especially when it comes to security issues. I mean, for instance, passports, those, electronic passports actually in chips, EU migration policy and EU Western Balkans cooperation on migration have been of crucial importance during, during the period of that Albania, for instance, was a candidate country, even today. So this is migration chapter is part of the stabilization and association process of EU relations with the Western Balkans. And as you can imagine, or Europeanization of whatever migration system in the Western Balkans is in a way dictated by the security issues or security, let's say, challenges and the control of irregular actual migration. So what I wanted to say with Europeanization is that individual states in the Western Balkans are not anymore, let's say, sovereign in terms of shaping or actually forming or creating or establishing whatever system in place without being part or being actually under the monitor of the European Union. So that's it. I hope I covered most of the, let's say, crucial points when it comes to both governance of migration and migration system, having as a reference point the Western Balkans migration system or subsystem. So thank you for your attention. Of course, I'd be happy to answer to your questions.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive and informative presentation. We are very happy to host you in our university as well. I would also like to thank you for sharing your thoughts on the governance of migration, which is a very important issue for Turkey, especially when you think the Turkey's relations with the EU. I know that you have many studies on the subject, in terms of Greece and Balkan countries. But for me, it seems to be that countries which do not face the problem, and I mean the migration problems, acts pragmatically, like pushing back the refugees back to the neighboring countries. In this regard, I'm wondering, and I'm also I'm curious about to know your opinion on this issue. What should be done for systemic governance of migration globally and also regionally, especially within the context of the EU?
It's a very good question. I don't know if I'm the person, the one that can actually answer this, because of legal issues within this kind of approach. At the same time, we have to recognize and to acknowledge the fact that we are talking about this anarchical system of international migration, which means that your it was an interesting question about this pushback. Let's say, you can say the policy, and here I guess you are talking about Greece. And of course, Greece is under the scrutiny of the court about this, all this, let's say, practices of pushback of both court and human rights organizations. And we know very well about the developments in Frontex with with the chief director that was actually last year or 2 years last year, I guess. He resigned from his position because of so-called allegations of pushback, which means that probably there is a hidden whatever mechanism or hidden agenda about actually misusing or whatever or accusing the other part, I mean, for not respecting the court agreement, for using or migrants as, let's say, as an instrument to push for, for bargaining and so on and so forth. So it's much more complicated, the governance of migration. But from a systemic point of view, the only thing I can say is that this is, let's say, an extension of the fact that we're talking about international system, which is again working independently. I mean, we have international law in place. We have conventions that most of the countries in the world have already ratified, and we have still witnessing this kind of practices, which means that there are problems when it comes to enforcing or to make whatever international obligation mandatory for those countries that do not abide, do not respect, or breach whatever. So it's a little bit actually goes beyond our whatever theories or academic sensitivities. It's a little bit more complicated.
Thank you so much for your input there. I do not see any questions in the chat box yet. If there are none, I would like to thank you on behalf of SSUA Faculty of Law for being here with us today and for enlightening us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you to all the participants who've joined us today. This is the end of our seminar.